The cabin stood alone, deep in the woods, a relic of forgotten times. Its wooden walls were weathered and worn, scratched by years of wind and rain. The windows, like vacant eyes, stared out blankly, reflecting the encroaching darkness. Trees pressed close, their branches gnarled and twisted, like skeletal fingers reaching out. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Silence hung heavy too, broken only by the occasional screech of a distant owl. The path to the cabin was overgrown, swallowed by the relentless advance of nature. Each step forward was a battle against encroaching vegetation. The setting sun cast long, eerie shadows, twisting familiar shapes into menacing forms. A sense of isolation pressed in, amplified by the growing darkness and the unsettling silence of the woods. The cabin waited, a silent sentinel in the gathering gloom. Sarah drove, her hands tight on the steering wheel. She was city-weary, her soul craving the solace of nature. The cabin, a family heirloom, promised peace, a chance to escape the cacophony of urban life. She hoped to find tranquility in the solitude, to reconnect with herself amidst the quiet grandeur of the woods. The weight of her life in the city, the deadlines, the noise, the constant motion had become unbearable. She longed for silence, for the simplicity of nature. The cabin, with its isolation and rustic charm, represented a return to a simpler time. A time before the relentless demands of the modern world. A time for reflection and healing. As she drove deeper into the woods, the anxieties of her city life began to recede. The silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves, was a balm to her frayed nerves. She rolled down the windows, inhaling the earthy scent of pine needles and damp earth. A sense of calm settled over her, a feeling of being miles away from the stresses she had left behind. The first night was the hardest. The silence, once a comfort, became oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the windows sent shivers down Sarah's spine. The wind howled through the trees, its mournful cry seeming to whisper her name. She tried to ignore it, to focus on the crackling fire in the hearth, but the unsettling sounds persisted. She told herself it was just the wind, just the house, settling. Old houses made noises, especially in the woods. But deep down, a primal fear began to stir. The isolation that had seemed so appealing in the city now felt oppressive, suffocating. The darkness outside the windows was no longer comforting, but menacing, hiding unseen eyes. Sleep came in fits and starts, punctuated by nightmares of unseen figures and disembodied whispers. Each time she woke, her heart pounding, she would lie awake, listening intently to the sounds of the night. The wind continued its mournful song, and the trees swayed rhythmically, their branches scraping against the roof like skeletal fingers trying to gain entry. Days turned into nights. Sarah tried to keep busy, chopping wood, reading, exploring the woods surrounding the cabin. But the unsettling feeling persisted, a constant undercurrent of unease. Shadows seemed to move at the edge of her vision. Shapes shifted in the darkness, resolving themselves into nothing when she turned her head. One evening, while preparing dinner, she heard a noise outside. A soft thud, like something heavy being dropped. She froze, listening intently. Silence. She chided herself for being paranoid. It was probably just an animal, a squirrel or a raccoon, knocking something over. But the feeling of being watched remained. That night she dreamt of a figure standing at the foot of her bed, tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence radiated a palpable sense of menace. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, the feeling of being watched clinging to her like a shroud. The phone lines were dead. Sarah had known they might be unreliable, but the reality of her isolation was now inescapable. She was truly alone, cut off from the outside world. The feeling of dread that had been building inside her intensified, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She tried to convince herself that it was just the isolation getting to her, that she was letting her imagination run wild. But the strange occurrences continued. Footprints in the dirt outside the cabin, too large to belong to any animal she knew. Objects moved, seemingly of their own accord. The whispers in the wind grew louder, more insistent. She thought about leaving, about packing up her things and driving back to the city. But something held her back, a strange compulsion to stay, to face whatever was haunting her. She knew it was irrational, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to be here, that something was waiting for her in the darkness. The phone rang, a shrill, jarring sound in the stillness of the cabin. Sarah stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't heard it ring before. She knew the lines were dead. Hesitantly, she reached out and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Her voice trembled, barely a whisper. A voice on the other end, raspy and distorted, like an old recording played over a bad connection. "Get out," it hissed. "Get out now." The line went dead. Sarah stood frozen, the receiver still clutched in her hand. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. Was it a prank, a wrong number, or something more sinister? The voice had been filled with such urgency, such palpable fear. It sent chills down her spine. Nightmares plagued her sleep. Vivid, terrifying dreams of being stalked through the woods by unseen entities. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, seeming to come from the walls themselves. Sarah felt her grip on reality slipping, her sanity slowly unraveling. The isolation, once a source of peace, now felt like a suffocating blanket of fear. She was trapped, hunted by something she couldn't see or understand. The cabin, once a refuge, had become a prison, its walls closing in on her, threatening to crush her. She tried to rationalize her fear, to tell herself it was just the stress, the isolation, playing tricks on her mind. But deep down she knew the truth. Something was wrong. Something dark and evil had taken root in this place, and it was closing in on her. One night, she woke to a sound, a soft scratching at her bedroom door. She lay frozen, listening intently. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like claws raking against the wood. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. Terror lent her a sudden burst of courage. She leaped out of bed, grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, and flung open the door. The hallway was empty, but the scratching continued, coming from the other side of the cabin, from the direction of the living room. She moved cautiously down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. The scratching grew louder as she approached the living room. She took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway. The room was dimly lit by the dying embers in the fireplace, shadows dancing on the walls, and then she saw it. A figure stood by the window, its back to her, tall and gaunt, its outline blurred and indistinct in the flickering firelight. It was scratching at the window pane, a low, guttural growl emanating from its throat. Panic surged through Sarah, threatening to overwhelm her. She raised the poker, her hand trembling, and took a step towards the figure. "Who's there?" she croaked, her voice hoarse with fear. The figure didn't respond. It continued to scratch at the window, its growl growing louder, more insistent. Another step. "Answer me!" she cried. The figure turned, slowly, deliberately, and Sarah gasped. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a grotesque mockery of human features. Twisted and contorted, its eyes glowed with an unholy light. A low, guttural growl rumbled in its chest, and it took a step towards her. Terror lent her wings. She spun on her heel and fled, the poker clattering to the floor behind her. She raced through the cabin, her mind screaming, her lungs burning. The creature, if that's what it was, gave chase, its heavy footsteps pounding behind her. She scrambled for the front door, her fingers fumbling with the lock. It wouldn't budge. She rattled the handle, panic rising in her throat. The creature was getting closer, its growls echoing through the cabin. She threw her weight against the door, but it wouldn't give. Desperation surged through her. She glanced around wildly, her eyes falling on the small window above the sink. It was her only chance. She scrambled onto the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature was almost upon her, its hot, fetid breath on the back of her neck. She threw open the window and squeezed through, ignoring the pain of splintering wood and tearing flesh. She didn't stop running until she reached the edge of the woods. Gasping for breath, her clothes torn, her body scratched and bleeding, she collapsed onto the dew-covered grass. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to paint the eastern sky with hues of pink and orange. Looking back at the cabin, now just a dark silhouette against the lightening sky, she couldn't believe she had escaped. What had happened that night? What was that creature? She had no answers, only questions that echoed in the silence of the dawning day. Sarah never returned to the cabin. The experience had shaken her to her core, leaving her with a profound fear of the dark and a lingering sense of unease. The whispers in the woods, the shadowy figure, the terror of that night, they would forever haunt her dreams, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks at the edges of our world. The mystery of the cabin in the woods remained unsolved, a chilling tale whispered around campfires, a warning to those who dared to venture too far into the unknown.